Okay. Okay, let's move on then to health and well, global health. Mark, what's the latest on the World Health Organization and treaties and so on?
This is a very important item, Mike. The World Pandemic Treaty is finally rearing its head. And what we're seeing on the screen here, the first slide, is a screenshot of the actual WHO literature on this. It's dated February 1st of this year. And it mentions there the fourth meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body, the INB, as I'll refer to it often, to draft and negotiate a WHO convention, agreement, or other international instrument, which they call legally binding in most respects, on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. That PPR is very common too. And the INB is comprised of representation from the WHO's 194 member states, for the record, and they will negotiate this zero draft initial treaty, this initial treaty draft called the zero draft, at its fourth INB meeting, and that's scheduled to start February 27th. Take note of that, February 27th, and it's going to be a series of meetings of the INB, as I understand it. Now, the next slide I'll briefly mention is from Health Policy Watch, and this is typical of what's going on, Mike. So far, as of this reading, as of today's UK column show, I've seen little to nothing, probably nothing, as far as I can tell, from the mass media cartel on this all-important and in many ways threatening WHO pandemic treaty. All they're talking about, as this Health Policy Watch article states here, is, for example, the headline here, Pandemic Treaty Zero Draft is out, proposes that the WHO gets 20% of all pandemic products to ensure equity. More of these globalese buzzwords, of course. Now, what they're talking about there is the only concern, like with the Nature journal, nature.com, Health Policy Watch, and other academic journals, think tanks, institutes, NGOs, things like that. And that's the only people talking about this. The news organizations are generally silent. All they're talking about is, well, the poorer countries during the pandemic of COVID-19, they didn't get their fair share of vaccines. So this time around, the WHO will control more pandemic resources, and these poorer countries, lucky them, will get more vaccines and more treatment,
Uh,
and they won't be left out.
Mark,
So that's
just to interrupt 1 second. They didn't get their fair share of jabs and vaccines, but they also didn't get their fair share of the deaths either, it seems.
correct, but that doesn't seem to compute with the world managers of our health system. Exactly. They're to be lauded maybe for not getting all those vaxes all those jabs, rather. I don't know that it was intentional that they resisted them, but they didn't get them, and they're better off for it. But moving on, there's a bit to cut through. Get out your machetes, as they say. But this is all very important stuff. Um, from the 32-page treaty draft itself, and I'll note that the treaty. Pardon me, just a moment. It has. Well, we'll come back to that. Anyway, um, we're going on with this. Background, methodology, and approach from page 1 of the 32-page treaty draft. It's 32 pages. It's got 38 articles, by the way, and 7 chapters, or 8 chapters, I believe it is. I'll look that up. In recognition of the catastrophic failure of the international community in showing solidarity and equity in response to the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic, the World Health Assembly convened a second special session in December of 2021 where it established the INB. That's where the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body came from, open to all member states, that's 194, and associate members, to draft and negotiate a WHO convention, agreement, or other international instrument on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response with a view to its adoption under Article 19 or under other provisions of the WHO Constitution as may be deemed appropriate by the INB. And it describes here what Article 19 is. Article 19 of the WHO Constitution provides the World Health Assembly with the authority to adopt conventions or agreements on any matter within the WHO's competence. Moving on to the next slide. The WHO Constitution, for the record, was adopted by the International Health Conference held in New York from June 19th to July 22nd, 1946, and signed on 22 July 1946 by the representatives of 61 states, and this WHO Constitution entered into force on the 7th of April 1948. Later amendments were incorporated, while Article 19 of the WHO Constitution provides scope to address all the matters under the competence of the WHO. Here it describes Article 21. Article 21 of the WHO Constitution empowers WHO and member states to address specific subject matters that require globally harmonized processes and regular updates without fragmenting regulatory jurisdictional reach and application. Note the language there. No fragmenting of regulatory jurisdictional reach and application. They want a very consolidated approach here. And this is all in the manner that that all of this mitigates against national sovereignty and national autonomy. Moving on, in furtherance of the above mandate, the INB established a process and systematic approach for its work and agreed at its second meeting that the instrument should be legally binding and contain both legally binding as well as non-legally binding elements. That's a little bit convoluted, but that's their wording. In that regard, the INB identified Article 19 of the WHO Constitution as the comprehensive provision under which the instrument should be adopted without prejudice to also considering, as work progressed, the suitability of Article 21, and requested the Bureau to develop and present to the INB a conceptual zero draft of the instrument, referred to herein as WHO CA Plus, for discussion. And this is just all the evolution and the development of this thing. Now we're getting into more concise matters. These are key points from the 49-point preamble. The zero draft, the initial draft of the treaty, has 49 points in its preamble. Number 1 and 2 are potentially at odds and appear contradictory. Notice number 1, reaffirming the principle of sovereignty of states parties in addressing public health matters, notably public prevention, preparedness, response, and health systems recovery. But then listen to number 2, recognizing the critical role of international cooperation and obligations for states to act in accordance with international law, including to respect, protect, and promote human rights. So number 1 says, recognizing the principle of sovereignty. Number 2 then turns it around and says, recognizing the critical role of international co-op and obligations for states to act in accordance with international law. Kind of an Orwellian Texas two-step there, you might say. Giveth, taketh away. And there's another thing that's worth mentioning. This isn't in the slides, but I'll mention this real briefly. This is very similar to the way any UN-related document works. The shifty language that we just read, that were 2 planks out of the 49 planks in the proposed treaty, is very similar to the UN Convention on Civil and Political Rights. Now listen to Article 9 of that UN Convention. No one shall be deprived of his liberty except on such grounds and in accordance with such procedure as are established by law. And this is very common throughout all sorts of UN conventions and even the UN Charter itself. And the WHO, of course, is the health arm of the UN. It's full of, yeah, you have rights unless we say you don't. Well, and the rights you do have, we grant you. So therefore, they're revocable. So the WHO initial zero draft treaty is no different. Now, moving on, cutting through the thicket a little bit more, recognizing the central role of the WHO as the directing and coordinating authority on the international health work in pandemic prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery of health systems, and in convening and generating scientific evidence, and more generally, fostering multilateral cooperation in global health governance. So there, the WHO is assuming the central role here in directing and coordinating this whole thing. And it adds there, recognizing that the international spread of disease is a global threat with serious consequences for public health, human lives, livelihoods, societies, and economies that calls for the widest possible international cooperation and participation of all countries and relevant stakeholders in an effective, coordinated, appropriate, and comprehensive international response. Again, even more language talking about consolidation and moving away from national autonomy in determining whether to wear masks and determining public health policy in upholding medical choice. None of that is even mentioned. And we're moving on here to a little bit more, and maybe you guys would want to offer some observations. We're cutting through this, recognizing that because the threat of pandemics is a reality and that pandemics have catastrophic health, social, economic, political consequences, and especially for persons in vulnerable situations. And here's the emphasis here: pandemic prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery of health systems must be systematically integrated into a whole of government and whole of society approach to ensure adequate political commitment, resourcing, and attention across sectors, and thereby break the cycle of panic and neglect. So they just go on to talk more about this. We can probably skip that one there because it's just more about whole of government and whole of society approaches. It keeps emphasizing that. We can move on to the next one. And this is more from the preamble. Whenever there's numbers there, they're from the preamble. And some of this is from the body of the Zero Draft Treaty, but here's more of the 49 points from the preamble. Recognizing the importance of working synergistically with other relevant areas under a One Health approach. And I'll abbreviate these things a little bit. That's number 24 in the preamble. Number 26 then says, reaffirming the importance of a One Health approach and the need for synergies between multispectral and cross-spectral collaboration at a national, regional, and international levels to safeguard human health, detect and prevent health threats at the animal and human interface, etc. Now that refers to the One Health approach, about which I just posted an article on the UK Column website. And the One Health approach, as I've discussed recently on this show, is about demoting humanity in the natural world and putting them on the same level as plant life and animal life. And that's been pushed by the Lancet, the UK-based medical journal, among other sources. And as we've surmised, that sounds very much like they want to treat people more on the level of livestock and just globally manage the health system without regards to individual rights, and putting us again on the same level as the rest of the animal kingdom and plant life and the ecosystems. So there's a lot going on here, reorienting the view of mankind and putting this treaty forward. And you guys have anything to add? We're just about through this description of some of the key elements of the Zero Draft. Do you have any counterpoint or observations?
Yes, but I think we'll keep it for extra, Mark, because because it's going to start a long conversation. So we'll keep a little bit of this for extra. Head on through the final 2 points here, and yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, there's just a little bit more here. And this is just a tiny smattering of what's in the 32 pages, 49-point preamble, 38 articles, and so on. Or, yeah, 38 articles, and I believe 8 chapters. Anyway, looking at this next slide, this is more 2 more points from the preamble. Recognizing that health is a precondition for and an outcome and indicator of the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development, and the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So not only is this connected to the mankind demoting One Health meme or concept, but this is also very much connected to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals. So this fits into the larger picture as we would have predicted. And then the final point that I pulled out of the preamble, recognizing that pandemics have a disproportionately heavy impact on frontline workers, notably health workers, the poor, and persons in vulnerable situations, with repercussions on health and development gains, in particular in developing countries, thus hampering the achievement of universal health coverage and the Sustainable Development Goals with their shared commitment to leave no one behind. So, this, in their own words, spells out just how potentially totalitarian and far reaching and consolidating this whole thing is. And the Brownstone Institute chimed in and made some very adroit observations. Thanks to Alex Thompson for sending this to me. Um, David Bell of the Brownstone Institute wrote this: amendments to WHO's International Health Regulations, an annotated guide. And this is very important what he put here. Keep in mind that Mr. Bell used to work for the WHO, which I'll describe here in a moment. He wrote this in his article: the COVID skeptic world has been claiming the WHO plans to become some sort of global autocratic government, removing national sovereignty and replacing it with a totalitarian health state. The near complete absence of interest by mainstream media would suggest to the rational observer that this is yet another conspiracy theory from the disaffected fringe. But, and here's my writing, Mr. Bell added, however, and he's a former medical representative with the WHO himself. He added, however, that in recent decades, the WHO has evolved to where now most funding is directed to specified uses, largely provided by private and corporate interests. The priorities of the WHO have evolved accordingly, moving away from community-centered care to a more vertical, commodity-based approach, following the self-interest of these funders. Those private interests include the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as well as the Gavi Vaccine Alliance and the Wellcome Trust, even while the World Bank and the G20 have elbowed their way in. So here we have a former medical officer with the WHO saying, well, maybe the conspiracists, quote unquote, aren't so far off after all because of the way the WHO has changed over the years. But as I pointed out, the WHO is part of the UN, and the way UN documents are worded and the way the whole system is set up, even without the private funding, this is still a very untrustworthy arrangement. Therefore, any treaty that comes out of it really ought to be fully resisted and exposed.
Yes.
So
Okay.
that should do it for now at this point.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. David, any thoughts briefly?
Well, I would just encourage people to look at Mark's article, because it brings forward really important points and makes connections between the World Health Organization and certain other accepted principles of global governance and global health, including and particularly the policy on abortion, and the policy on population and population control. So Mark's bringing these threads together. I think it's a very interesting article, and I would encourage people to look it out.
Okay, thank you.